The plains stretched endlessly under a burning sky. The grass whispered stories of warriors, hunters, and spirits. And in the middle of that vast silence, a boy was born, a boy who would grow into a legend. His name was Tatanka Iyotake, which means Sitting Bull. He was born around 1831, near the Grand River in what is now South Dakota. He belonged to the Hunkpapa Lakota Sioux, one of the proudest and strongest tribes of the Great Plains. From the beginning, there was something different about him. He was quiet, calm, and thoughtful, not like most boys his age. While others played or shouted, he would sit alone, watching the movement of the buffalo or the shadows of the clouds. His father once said, "He listens to the wind like it's speaking to him," and maybe it was. The Lakota lived close to nature. They believed every mountain, river, and animal carried a spirit, a living force that spoke to those who could hear. Young Sitting Bull was one of those rare souls who listened deeply. Even as a child, he was known for his patience and understanding. He didn't rush to speak. He thought before he acted, but he was not weak. When he turned 10 years old, his father began to train him as a warrior. He learned to ride bareback, to aim a bow while galloping, to track animals for days without losing the trail. He learned discipline, the kind that turns fear into focus. The elders saw something special in him. They said his eyes were like the still surface of a lake, calm on the outside, but deep and full of strength underneath. One evening, around the fire, his father told him stories about bravery, stories of warriors who fought to protect their people. Young Sitting Bull listened, his face glowing in the firelight. He wanted to be one of those men, not for fame, but to protect his tribe and their way of life. Soon, he got his chance. When he was just 14 years old, a conflict broke out between the Lakota and a rival tribe, the Crow. It was time for his first battle. The morning was cold, the air sharp with tension. He rode beside his father, clutching a small bow. The warriors painted their faces, red for courage, black for power. Sitting Bull's heart pounded in his chest, but he did not show fear. When the fight began, chaos filled the valley, arrows flying, horses charging, men shouting. In the middle of that storm, the boy saw an enemy warrior racing toward his father. Without thinking, he spurred his horse forward and fired. His arrow struck true. The enemy fell. It was his first victory. When they returned to camp, the elders honored him. He was no longer a boy. He had earned the name of a warrior. From that day, Tatanka Iyotake began to build his legend. But greatness is never just about strength. As the years passed, Sitting Bull became known for something even more powerful, his wisdom. He was a thinker, a dreamer, and a man who believed that true power came from peace. He watched as the white settlers, the Wasichu, as the Lakota called them, moved closer and closer into their lands. He saw the buffalo herds begin to disappear. He saw rivers once sacred turned into roads for wagons, and he understood something few others did, that a storm was coming. The United States government began to send men to make treaties. They wanted the Lakota to give up their hunting grounds, to move to small pieces of land called reservations. In return, they promised food, tools, and peace. But Sitting Bull knew their promises were like dust. They would vanish with the wind. He said, "The white man knows how to make everything, except how to stop." And he refused to sign. To the Lakota, he became more than a warrior. He became a spiritual leader, a man who could speak to the Great Spirit and see what others could not. He began to have visions, dreams filled with meaning and warning. In one dream, he saw his people surrounded by white soldiers. He saw danger and destiny. The young warrior who had once fought for pride now fought for something greater, the survival of his people, their freedom and their spirit. As he sat by the fire at night, the wind carried whispers from the plains. He closed his eyes and listened. The land was changing. The future was uncertain. But Sitting Bull knew one thing: he would never surrender what was sacred. He once told his people, "If we must die, we die defending our land." Those words would become a prophecy and the story of his life. This was only the beginning. The boy who rode into battle at 14 would one day lead an entire nation into defiance. The world would remember his name, not as a man of war, but as the spirit of resistance itself. Years passed, and the young warrior who once rode beside his father was now a man. Sitting Bull had seen blood, victory, and loss. He had fought battles against rival tribes and proved his courage many times. But what made him different was not his skill with weapons, it was his heart. He began to realize that strength alone could not protect his people. The world was changing too fast. The white settlers were not like other tribes. They came not to fight and leave, but to stay and take. They built towns, roads, and forts. They hunted the buffalo not for need, but for sport. Sitting Bull watched them come in endless lines, covering the open land like ants, and he understood something terrible. This was not just a war for land. It was a war for survival. Sitting Bull became known among his people for his wisdom. He spoke softly, but when he did, others listened. He was calm in anger, steady in danger, and humble even in victory. The Lakota respected men who could see beyond the next hunt or the next fight. They saw that in him. As the Lakota world began to tremble under the pressure of American expansion, Sitting Bull's role grew. He became a chief not by election or appointment, but by trust. The people followed him because they believed he could guide them through the darkness ahead. He was also a holy man, a person who could speak to the spirits through prayer and dreams. He fasted often and sought visions that would show him what lay ahead. His power was not just of the body, but of the spirit. When the people lost hope, they turned to him. He taught them patience, courage, and unity. He reminded them that they were the children of the Great Spirit and that their way of life was sacred. "Hold fast to your traditions," he said, "for they are the roots that will keep you standing when the storm comes." The storm was already forming. The U.S. government began to break its promises. Treaties signed in peace were quickly torn apart when gold was found in the Black Hills, land sacred to the Lakota. Soldiers marched through their hunting grounds. Miners dug into the mountains that the Lakota believed were alive with spirits. To Sitting Bull, this was not just disrespect, it was desecration. He warned his people that the white man's hunger for gold would never stop. And he was right. The army soon ordered all Native Americans to move on to reservations. Those who refused were called hostile and hunted, but Sitting Bull would not leave the open plains. He said, "I wish to live where my fathers lived. I will not trade my freedom for a piece of paper." Those words spread through every Lakota camp like fire. Warriors and families began to gather around him. They came from many tribes, Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, drawn by his courage and his vision. For the first time in many years, the scattered nations began to unite. Sitting Bull's camp grew until thousands followed him. He taught peace first, saying that fighting should be the last choice. But when the U.S. soldiers entered their land again and again, he knew that peace would no longer hold. The soldiers came to force them onto reservations. They wanted the tribes to give up their weapons, their horses, their freedom. To Sitting Bull, this was impossible. The plains were life itself, the rivers, the buffalo, the stars above. To give up that freedom was to stop being Lakota. He became a symbol of resistance. Even those who had never met him spoke his name with respect. They said he could see things before they happened. They said his dreams were messages from the Great Spirit. One of his closest friends, Crazy Horse, a fierce and fearless warrior, joined him. Together, they would lead one of the greatest stands in Native American history. But that moment was still to come. For now, Sitting Bull continued to build his strength quietly. He trained young warriors not only to fight but to think. A warrior's first duty is to protect, he told them, not to destroy. He spoke to mothers and elders, telling them to hold on to their language and their songs. He reminded everyone that they were still free. "Do not be afraid," he said. "The Great Spirit watches us. We will endure." As the seasons changed, tension grew. The soldiers built more forts. The buffalo grew fewer. The old ways began to fade like smoke in the wind. One night, as Sitting Bull sat by his fire, he looked up at the stars. He knew that the time for peace was almost over. The vision he had seen years before, of his people surrounded by soldiers, was beginning to take shape. He did not fear it. He only prayed that his people would face what was coming with strength and dignity. In his heart, he carried the weight of an entire nation. He knew that history would soon test them in ways no Lakota had ever faced, and when that test came, Sitting Bull would not run or hide. He would stand, as his name promised, firm and unmoving, like a bull sitting before the storm. He was no longer just a man. He was a leader chosen by destiny, prepared by pain, and guided by the spirits of his ancestors. The world beyond the plains might have called him a rebel, a troublemaker, even a threat. But to his people, he was hope itself, and soon the name Sitting Bull would echo across America as the man who defied an empire. The land that once stretched free and wild was changing. The buffalo herds that had thundered across the plains for centuries were growing smaller every year. The rivers still flowed, but their banks were now crossed by wagon tracks. The air smelled not only of grass and smoke, but of iron and dust. Sitting Bull watched this change with a heavy heart. He had warned his people that the white man's hunger for land would never end, and now it was happening before his eyes. The U.S. government had promised that the Black Hills would belong to the Lakota forever. That promise lasted only until gold was discovered there. After that, soldiers, miners, and settlers poured into the sacred land. They came with shovels, guns, and greed. To the Lakota, the Black Hills were holy, the place where their ancestors' spirits lived. No one could own them, not even a chief. But the government did not understand that. They sent soldiers to build forts and guard the miners, ignoring every treaty they had signed. Sitting Bull saw it clearly. The white men did not come for peace. They came to take. He gathered his people and spoke with calm but firm words. They promise us peace, but their words are hollow. They will come again, and they will not stop. We must stand together or lose everything we love. His voice spread through the camps of the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho. Families began to leave the reservations and join him in the open plains. They built a great camp by the Little Bighorn River, where thousands gathered, the largest assembly of native tribes ever seen. Sitting Bull was not a man of anger. He did not seek war, but he knew that war was coming. The white soldiers called him a troublemaker, a rebel. Newspapers printed his name like a curse. But to his people, he was the last hope for freedom. Every sunrise brought new tension. The soldiers kept moving closer. The buffalo were nearly gone, and the government believed the only way to control the tribes was to force them onto small reservations where they would depend on government food and clothing. But Sitting Bull refused. He said, "We were born free, and we will die free." His words became the voice of every warrior and mother who refused to give up. In the spring of 1876, Sitting Bull felt the storm building. He began to prepare, not only with weapons but with prayer. He knew that the battle ahead would decide the future of his people. He fasted for days without food or water and prayed to the Great Spirit for guidance. He wanted to know whether his people would live or die in the coming fight. Then, during his vision quest, a dream came to him, clear and powerful. He saw soldiers falling upside down from the sky, tumbling like grasshoppers. He heard the voice of the spirits telling him, "These soldiers will fall into your camp." When he woke, he shared his vision with his people. They listened in silence. To them, it meant that victory would come, but only if they stood strong and united. His vision gave them courage. It spread across the plains like wind through tall grass. Warriors painted their faces. Horses were prepared. Arrows were sharpened. But Sitting Bull himself did not rush to fight. He was a spiritual leader, not a war chief. He left the battlefield command to others, brave men like Crazy Horse and Gall, but his presence gave them faith. As the summer of 1876 arrived, the U.S. Army sent several columns of soldiers to find the hostile tribes and force them back to the reservations. Among them was a proud officer, General George Armstrong Custer, a man famous for his boldness and hunger for glory. Custer believed that the native warriors would run when he attacked. He did not know that this time the tribes were waiting. Back in the great camp, Sitting Bull continued to pray. He told the warriors that courage came not from hate but from truth. "Fight to protect, not to destroy," he reminded them. "Fight for your children and for the land that gave you life." The soldiers were getting closer every day. Scouts brought news that Custer's cavalry was on the move. Thousands of warriors began to gather under the open sky, following the leadership of their chiefs and the faith of Sitting Bull's vision. The air felt charged, like lightning before a storm. Mothers held their children close. Warriors painted symbols on their bodies, red for strength, black for victory, yellow for the sun. Every man, woman, and child knew that history was about to change. Sitting Bull stood before his people, tall and calm. His eyes looked toward the horizon where the soldiers would come. He said, "They think we are weak because we love peace, but they will learn that our peace is built on strength." He did not smile. He did not shout. He simply waited, like the land itself, ancient and unyielding. In the distance, the sound of horses carried through the wind. The moment had come. Soon the soldiers would charge into the valley of the Little Bighorn, believing they could crush the spirit of a nation. But Sitting Bull had already seen what would happen. He had seen the soldiers fall, just as the spirits had shown him. The storm he had warned about was here. And when it passed, the world would never forget the name Sitting Bull, the man who stood still while empires moved against him. The summer sun burned high over the wide plains. The air was dry and still, heavy with tension. Every bird, every horse, every human in Sitting Bull's great camp could feel it. Something was about to happen. For weeks, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes had gathered together near the Little Bighorn River. Thousands of people, men and women, old and young, had come because of Sitting Bull's vision. The dream that soldiers would fall from the sky like grasshoppers. They believed in that dream. It gave them courage. The camp was alive with energy. Warriors repaired their bows and sharpened their knives. Women cooked over open fires and children played beside the river. But beneath the ordinary sounds of life, everyone felt the same pulse, the heartbeat of something greater coming closer. Sitting Bull sat in his lodge, his face calm. He was not the war chief. He would not lead men into battle. His strength was different. He was the spiritual center of his people, the one who gave them faith that the Great Spirit was with them. He had performed the sun dance, a sacred ceremony of pain and prayer, only days before. He had cut deep wounds into his chest and danced until he fell into a trance. It was during that trance that his vision came again, clearer, stronger. He saw soldiers, hundreds of them, falling upside down into the camp. It was a sign of victory. He told the warriors, "Do not fear them. They will come, and they will fall." The message spread quickly. Some laughed, some felt joy, and others trembled. But none doubted him. Sitting Bull's words were sacred. His visions had never been wrong. Far away, General George Armstrong Custer was on the march. He was a proud man, a soldier hungry for glory. He believed that the native tribes were weak and scattered. When his scouts told him of the large camp near the Little Bighorn, he saw it not as danger, but as opportunity. He wanted to strike fast and surprise them. He believed he could win in a single day. Custer's confidence was his greatest weapon and his greatest mistake. On June 25, 1876, his soldiers rode toward the valley. The sun was bright, the air dry, and the hills echoed with the sound of hooves. They thought the village below them was small, but as they drew closer, they saw it stretch far and wide, thousands of teepees shining in the light, smoke rising into the sky. Still, Custer ordered the attack. He divided his men into groups and rode forward, believing victory was certain. Down in the valley, a woman fetching water saw the dust first, a long cloud rolling toward the camp. She shouted a warning. In seconds, the peaceful rhythm of the village exploded into chaos. Warriors leapt to their horses. Drums began to beat. Shouts filled the air. The women and children ran for safety as the men rode out to meet the soldiers. Sitting Bull stepped outside his lodge. He stood quietly, watching as warriors streamed past him, painted, armed, and full of fury. He prayed to the Great Spirit, saying, "Let my people stand brave this day." Then the battle began. The valley of the Little Bighorn shook with gunfire and war cries. Custer's men charged into the village, but they were outnumbered, surrounded, and trapped. Warriors attacked from every direction. Horses screamed. Bullets tore through the air. For the first time, the soldiers realized what they had done. They had ridden into a sea of warriors who were fighting for their homes, their families, and their freedom. Custer tried to rally his men, but it was too late. The Lakota and Cheyenne closed in. Some fought with rifles, others with bows and spears. The battle lasted less than an hour. When it was over, every one of Custer's soldiers lay dead. The vision had come true. When the dust settled, the warriors stood in silence. They had won a great victory, one that would echo across history. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was over. Sitting Bull did not celebrate. He did not shout or boast. He simply sat and looked to the sky. His vision had been fulfilled, but he knew what it meant. He said quietly, "Now they will never rest." He was right. The victory filled his people with pride, but it also filled the U.S. government with rage. Newspapers called it a massacre. The army called it revenge. Within weeks, more soldiers were sent west, thousands of them. They came with heavier guns, more horses, and a single goal: to destroy the tribes that had dared to fight back. Sitting Bull knew this was only the beginning. The Great Spirit had given them one triumph, but the storm that followed would be far worse. He told his people, "We have won the battle, but the war for our freedom has just begun." And as the sun set over the valley that night, the smoke from the fires rose into the orange sky. The river flowed quietly, carrying away the blood of both warriors and soldiers. The land was silent again, but it was a different silence now, heavy, sacred, and sad. Sitting Bull's name spread far beyond the plains. To his people, he was the guardian of their spirit. To the U.S. government, he became a symbol of resistance. To the world, he became the man who had defied an empire. But the victory at Little Bighorn would also mark the turning point in his life, a point from which there was no return. He had seen the power of faith, but now he would see the cost of freedom. The storm had not ended. It had only begun to roar louder. The smoke from the Battle of the Little Bighorn had barely cleared when the wind carried the news across the country. To the native people, it was a victory. To the United States, it was an outrage. The newspapers called it Custer's last stand. They painted Sitting Bull as a villain, a savage who had dared to defy the power of the American army. The government demanded revenge. Thousands of soldiers were sent west. They built new forts and hunted the Lakota like animals. Wherever the tribes moved, the soldiers followed. The plains, once open and free, now echoed with the thunder of military boots. Sitting Bull understood what was coming. He told his people, "The white men will not forgive us. Their anger is like a fire that does not die." He gathered his followers, men, women, and children, and made a painful decision. He would lead them north, across the border into Canada, beyond the reach of the U.S. Army. It was a long, harsh journey. The summer sun burned their skin by day, and the cold bit deep at night. They rode horses, carried babies, and dragged what little they had left. But they did not complain. Freedom was worth the pain. After weeks of travel, they finally crossed into Saskatchewan, where they believed they would find safety. There, Sitting Bull hoped to start again, to live in peace, to hunt, and to keep the old ways alive. At first, Canada welcomed them. The land was open and wild, with rivers and game. The Lakota built new camps, hunted buffalo, and tried to forget the war they had left behind. But freedom came with hunger. The buffalo herds were fewer than before, and winter in the north was cruel. The cold cut through their thin clothes. The snow fell heavy and stayed long. Many nights, fires burned low as people shared their last bits of food. Sitting Bull stayed strong. He visited every teepee, spoke to every family, and told them to keep faith. "The Great Spirit watches over us," he said. "We will not be forgotten." But inside, even he began to worry. He had led his people away from war, but he could not protect them from hunger. The Canadian officials were polite but distant. They would not give food or shelter unless Sitting Bull agreed to move his people onto their own reservation. But Sitting Bull refused. He said, "My people are not beggars. We will live as we have always lived, free." As the months turned into years, the struggle grew harder. Many of his warriors grew restless. Some left, sneaking back to the United States to surrender in exchange for food and protection. Others stayed, their faces thin from hunger, but their spirits still proud. Sitting Bull's heart ached to see his people suffer. He often sat alone at the edge of camp, watching the horizon, thinking of the home they had lost. He had won the battle at Little Bighorn, but now he faced a greater enemy: despair. By 1881, after nearly 4 years in exile, the situation had become unbearable. The buffalo were gone. The people were starving. Children cried through the night. The Great Plains were no longer a land of freedom. They were a grave of memories. Sitting Bull made the hardest decision of his life. He would return to the United States and surrender. When his people heard this, many wept. They could not believe that their proud leader would go back to the very army that had hunted them. But Sitting Bull told them, "I will go because my people must live. I am the last to give up, but I cannot let my children die." He led his followers south, crossing the border once more. Soldiers met them near Fort Buford, North Dakota. Sitting Bull rode forward, tall and silent on his horse. When he reached the fort, he dismounted and said, "I wish it to be remembered that I was the last man of my tribe to surrender my rifle." Those words marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The soldiers treated him with caution. Some respected him, others feared him. He was placed under arrest and sent to live at Fort Randall, where he spent nearly 2 years as a prisoner. Yet even in captivity, Sitting Bull's dignity never faded. He walked proudly, spoke calmly, and prayed every day. The guards often said that when he looked at them, it felt as if he could see straight through their souls. He used his time to teach his people patience. "We are still Lakota," he reminded them. "No one can take that away." When he was finally allowed to return to his tribe, the government sent him to the Standing Rock Reservation. There, life was different. Small houses instead of teepees, soldiers instead of chiefs, English words instead of Lakota prayers. But even on the reservation, Sitting Bull's spirit was unbroken. He became a symbol of pride, a living reminder of what freedom had once been. To the white men, he was a former enemy. To his people, he was still their leader. And as he stood on the edge of the reservation one evening, watching the sun fall behind the plains, he whispered to himself, "The land is still here. The wind still speaks. We are still a people. The war was over." But the fight for the soul of his nation was not. The man who had once defied an empire was now a prisoner of peace, yet his heart remained free. Years had passed since Sitting Bull had laid down his rifle at Fort Buford. The warrior who once led thousands into battle was now living quietly at the Standing Rock Reservation. He was older now. His hair had turned gray, his shoulders heavier, but his eyes, sharp and deep, still carried the strength of a man who had seen the rise and fall of nations. The reservation life was hard. The government controlled everything: food, clothes, travel, even the way the Lakota prayed. The people were told to become farmers, to send their children to schools where their language was forbidden. It was not freedom. It was survival. Sitting Bull endured it with quiet pride. He still wore his traditional clothes. He still spoke his language. He refused to cut his hair or bow to the new rules. To the U.S. agents, he was stubborn. To his people, he was still a chief. Every day, visitors came to see him: soldiers, photographers, and curious white men who wanted to look upon the famous warrior who had defeated General Custer. Some came out of respect. Others came to stare. Sitting Bull said little to them. He did not speak to please strangers. Then, in 1885, something unexpected happened. A man named William Buffalo Bill Cody came to visit. He was a showman, a former scout turned entertainer who traveled across the country with his Wild West show. His performances recreated battles, rodeo acts, and scenes from frontier life. He wanted to hire Sitting Bull to join the show as a living legend, the famous Indian chief who had once defeated Custer. At first, Sitting Bull refused. He was no clown to be put on display. But when he learned that his appearance could bring money to feed his people, he agreed. He said, "If my going helps my children, I will go." And so, the once feared chief became a performer in a traveling show. For 4 months, Sitting Bull toured across the United States and even into Canada, riding in parades and sitting before cheering crowds. He wore his traditional clothing and feathered headdress, proud and silent as the people clapped and shouted his name. The irony was bitter. The same America that had tried to destroy him now celebrated him as a hero, but Sitting Bull never forgot who he was. He used his fame wisely. When he rode through cities, people crowded the streets to see him. They expected an angry savage. Instead, they saw a calm, noble man who shook hands gently and smiled at children. He signed autographs for $1 each and gave the money to orphans and the poor. He once said, "The white man knows how to make everything, but he does not know how to share." The newspapers wrote stories about him. Some mocked him. Others admired him. Many were surprised to find that the man they had been taught to fear was kind, thoughtful, and wise. During his travels, Sitting Bull met many people, including Annie Oakley, the famous sharpshooter known as Little Sure Shot. He respected her skill with a gun and gave her the Lakota name Watanya Cecilia. Some say he called her his adopted daughter. He also met politicians and army officers, some of whom had once hunted him. They shook his hand now and smiled for photographs, but Sitting Bull's face stayed unreadable. He did not hate them. He had learned that hatred only fed sorrow. but he did not trust them either. When he returned to Standing Rock later that year, his people welcomed him with songs and dances. He brought back stories of cities, trains, and crowds, a world so different from the plains they had known. But behind his calm words was sadness. He had seen how much the world had changed. The buffalo were gone. The land was fenced. The old life, the life of the Lakota, was fading like smoke in the wind. Sitting Bull often sat outside his small cabin, looking out across the plains. He still wore his feathers and prayed each morning to the Great Spirit. He told his people, "The earth is old, but she remembers everything. One day the truth will live again." Though he was no longer a warrior in battle, his spirit still fought, not against soldiers, but against forgetting. He told stories to the children about the old days, about honor, respect, and freedom. He reminded them that their ancestors' strength still flowed in their blood. He said, "As long as you remember who you are, the Lakota will never die." But even in peace, there were eyes watching him. The government agents did not like his influence. They called him dangerous, saying he stirred unrest among the tribes. They feared that he still carried power, not of weapons, but of words. Sitting Bull ignored them. He lived simply, raising horses and helping his people as best he could. But deep inside, he knew another storm was coming. Rumors had begun to spread across the reservations about a new movement, a dance, a prophecy, something that promised the return of the buffalo and the old world. The people called it the Ghost Dance, and soon, that movement would pull Sitting Bull once more into the center of history. One final time. The wind over Standing Rock carried strange new songs. They came from distant reservations, soft rhythms that spoke of hope, of lost buffalo, of ancestors returning. People called it the Ghost Dance. It began far to the west, with a Paiute prophet named Wovoka, who said he had seen a vision of a new world. In that world, the buffalo would return, the white man's rule would fade, and native people would live again in peace. The message spread like fire through dry grass. Hungry and beaten tribes embraced it because it promised something no government could give: hope. When the news reached Standing Rock, the people whispered Sitting Bull's name. They said the prophecy was meant for him, the man who had already seen visions come true. If he believed, surely the Great Spirit's promise was real. But Sitting Bull was cautious. He had seen what blind hope could do. He told his followers, "The dance is not a weapon. Pray if you must, but do not give them reason to fear us." He knew the government would not understand. To the white agents, the Ghost Dance looked like rebellion. Within months, fear spread through the forts and agencies. Reports claimed the tribes were preparing for war. The army grew restless. Washington sent new orders: watch Sitting Bull closely. By 1890, the reservation was a prison in all but name. Rations were cut. Sickness spread. Children starved while warehouses filled with food meant for them. The Ghost Dance became their only comfort. Men and women danced for hours in circles, their faces turned to the sky, their feet pounding the frozen earth until they fell from exhaustion. Sitting Bull watched quietly. He did not join, but he did not stop them either. He understood that his people needed to believe in something, anything. When they asked if he believed in the new prophecy, he said, "I believe in the Great Spirit. If he wishes the buffalo to return, he will do it in his time." To the frightened Indian agents, that was enough to label him dangerous again. Agent James McLaughlin, who controlled Standing Rock, wrote letters to the army claiming Sitting Bull was planning an uprising. He said, "If we do not act soon, he will lead the entire Sioux Nation against us." It was a lie born of fear and pride. But Washington believed it. The order came: arrest Sitting Bull. Bring him in alive if possible. Before dawn on December 15, 1890, 40 Indian police surrounded Sitting Bull's cabin. The winter air was sharp and silent. Inside, the old chief slept beside his family. They knocked loudly. Sitting Bull rose slowly and stepped outside, calm as ever. He looked at the men and said, "Why have you come with guns against your own people?" They told him he was under arrest. He did not resist. He said, "I will go with you." There is no need for blood. But outside, his supporters were gathering. The sound of horses and angry voices filled the morning. They shouted for him not to go. The tension cracked like ice under weight. In the confusion, a shot rang out. No one knew who fired first. Then chaos. Bullets flew. Smoke filled the air. When it was over, Sitting Bull lay in the snow, a bullet through his chest. He was 59 years old. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The man who had seen soldiers fall like grasshoppers now lay still beneath the winter sky. His blood darkened the white snow. His people wept quietly. Even some of the Indian police bowed their heads in shame. They buried him near the Grand River, close to the place of his birth. Later, some said his body was moved to Mobridge, South Dakota. No one knows for sure, but the plains still hold his spirit. News of his death spread quickly. Newspapers celebrated it as the end of resistance. But for Native people, it was the end of an era, the final breaking of the old world. Just 2 weeks later, tragedy struck again at Wounded Knee, where hundreds of men, women, and children were killed by U.S. soldiers. Some said Sitting Bull's spirit walked that field, guiding the fallen to peace. Though he was gone, his words remained, "What life I have left I want to spend in peace and friendship. But I will never give up my right to think for myself." Sitting Bull's life had been a circle, from freedom to battle, from exile to fame, and finally to sacrifice. He fought not because he loved war, but because he loved peace. He stood firm because he believed that dignity was worth dying for. Even as the world changed around him, he never changed his heart. To his enemies, he was a rebel. To his people, he was a father. To history, he became a symbol, the man who would not bow. The winds still sweep across the plains where he once rode, whispering his Lakota name, Tatanka Iotake, Sitting Bull. And though the empire he defied has long since faded into history, his story remains, a reminder that courage does not always come from the sword, but from standing firm when the world demands you kneel. The snow had melted over the plains where Sitting Bull fell, but his spirit did not rest. Even in death, his name echoed through every Lakota camp, carried by wind and memory. The people mourned him as they would a father. They sang songs of his courage, his dreams, and his strength. Old warriors spoke by the fire, telling children how he had seen victory before it came, how he had stood unbroken when empires tried to crush him. He was gone, but his story became their strength. For the U.S. government, his death meant control. They believed the last spark of resistance was gone. But what they did not understand was that you cannot kill a spirit that lives in hearts. Sitting Bull's legacy was not written on paper. It was written in the souls of his people. The years that followed were dark for the Lakota. The buffalo were gone. The children were taken to boarding schools, where their hair was cut and their language forbidden. The old songs fell silent for a time, and the people lived under the shadow of loss. Yet, through it all, Sitting Bull's memory remained like a fire that never went out. His name was whispered in prayers and sung in secret songs. He became a symbol of what it meant to stand proud, even when everything was taken away. To the Lakota, he was not just a man who fought battles. He was the one who reminded them who they were. He had said, "The earth is our mother. The rivers are our brothers. The sky is our father." Those words lived on long after the guns had fallen silent. Over time, stories about Sitting Bull began to reach the outside world. Writers, journalists, and historians tried to tell his story, some truthfully, others not. Many called him a chief, though in Lakota tradition, he had been more than that, a holy man, a visionary, a protector of his people's spirit. In white history books, he was often shown as a rebel, a warrior who resisted progress. But for Native people, he was a hero who defended the right to live free on the land of his ancestors. As the decades passed, America began to see him differently, not as an enemy, but as one of its most powerful symbols of resistance and honor. In the early 1900s, the Lakota began to hold ceremonies again. At these gatherings, elders told the young ones about the old days, about Sitting Bull's courage and his faith. His story gave them hope to reclaim their identity. Later, in the 20th century, Native activists invoked his name in their fight for civil rights. During the 1960s and 70s, when Native Americans marched for justice and sovereignty, many carried banners that read, "Remember Sitting Bull." He became a voice for all those who refused to be forgotten. His image appeared in murals, books, and films. But even as his face became famous, the true meaning of his life remained simple: freedom, dignity, and faith. At Standing Rock and across the Great Plains, his descendants and relatives still tell his story. They speak of the man who refused to sign treaties that betrayed his people, who dreamed of soldiers falling before they did, who surrendered not in defeat, but to save lives. They speak of the chief who rode with honor and prayed for peace. Today, visitors come from all over the world to see the place where he was born and where he died. They leave offerings, tobacco, feathers, or simple words of thanks. Many say that when the wind blows across the prairie, it feels like he is still there, watching, protecting. In schools and museums, his story is now told with respect. Historians describe him as one of the greatest leaders of the Native American resistance. His name stands beside those of Crazy Horse, Red Cloud, and Geronimo, men who refused to surrender their souls. But Sitting Bull was more than a warrior of the past. His legacy continues in the present, in every act of resistance, every movement for native rights, every person who stands for justice. He showed that strength is not always about fighting. Sometimes it is about standing firm in truth, even when you stand alone. The Lakota still honor him through songs and gatherings. Each year, they ride on horseback across the plains to remember his journey, from freedom to exile, from fame to martyrdom. They call it the Sitting Bull Memorial Ride. It is not a march of sorrow, but of pride. In a world that changes too fast, his story remains timeless. He reminds us that every people, every nation must protect its spirit. He reminds us that peace without dignity is not peace at all. Sitting Bull once said, "I am not against white men. I am for my own people." Those words echo even today, not as a message of hate, but of balance, of belonging, of love for one's roots. His vision still speaks, that no matter how great the power of empires, truth and spirit will always endure. That the land remembers, that courage lives forever in those who stand for what is right. And so, long after his body returned to the earth, his voice still rides on the wind across the plains. When thunder rolls and the horizon burns gold with sunset, the people say that is Tatanka Iyotake, the Sitting Bull, the one who defied an empire and became immortal. Many winters had passed since Sitting Bull's death, yet his story refused to fade. The plains he once rode were quiet now, carved by fences and roads. The buffalo no longer thundered across the horizon, but the people, his people, still carried his name like a sacred fire. Generations came and went, but the legend of Sitting Bull only grew stronger. He was no longer just a man of flesh and blood. He had become a spirit of resistance, a voice that whispered across time. Among the Lakota, elders still spoke of him with reverence. They told the young ones, "Remember Sitting Bull. He fought not for war, but for peace. He stood not for power, but for truth." Every story carried a lesson about honor, courage, and the duty to protect what is sacred. To his people, he was not dead. He had simply become one with the land he loved, the rivers, the mountains, the sky. When the wind blew over the prairies, the old ones would say, "That is Tatanka Iyotake riding again." In the decades that followed, America began to remember him differently. The same nation that once hunted him now began to study him, to write about him, to understand what he had stood for. At first he appeared in history books as an enemy, the man who killed Custer. But slowly people began to see the truth. Sitting Bull was not a villain. He was a leader who defended his people against broken promises and invasion. Historians began to call him one of the greatest Native American leaders in history. Artists painted his face. Poets wrote his name. His strong gaze, captured in old photographs, became a symbol of pride and defiance. In schools and museums, children learned that he had seen beyond battle, that he had dreamed of a world where his people could live with dignity and peace. They read his words, "Let us put our minds together and see what kind of life we can make for our children." Those words spoke not just to the Lakota, but to everyone who heard them. In the 20th century, when Native Americans began to rise again for their rights, Sitting Bull's name returned to the front lines. During the 1960s and 70s, young activists carried his image on banners during protests. They saw in him the strength to stand tall against injustice. He became a symbol of unity, proof that one voice, if spoken with courage, could echo forever. In 1973, at Wounded Knee, Native activists stood against the government once again. They called themselves the American Indian Movement, and they invoked Sitting Bull's spirit for strength. They believed that his fight had never truly ended, It had only changed shape. It was no longer about rifles and soldiers, but about identity, land, and truth. Sitting Bull's legacy lived not just in politics, but in culture. Songs, films, and books told his story to new generations. In 1954, a Hollywood movie was made about him, though the real story, the sacred truth, could never fit into 2 hours of film. Artists painted him as both warrior and prophet, his eyes steady, his face proud, a reminder that history cannot erase spirit. Today, at Standing Rock and across the Great Plains, his descendants and the Lakota people still honor him. They gather each year to remember his life. They ride on horseback across the same plains he once crossed, the Sitting Bull Memorial Ride. They sing songs in the Lakota tongue and raise the tribal flag high, carrying his dream forward. When the Standing Rock protests began in 2016 against the oil pipeline, many said Sitting Bull's spirit had returned once more. Thousands of native and non-native people stood together to protect the land and water. On banners and shirts, one phrase appeared again and again: Tatanka Iotake, the spirit lives. It was as if the old chief had risen with the wind to remind his people that the earth must be protected, that the fight for life never truly ends. In classrooms, museums, and communities around the world, people now speak his name with respect. He is remembered not for hate or rebellion, but for his deep love for his people, for his land, and for freedom. Sitting Bull's story crosses time and borders. He stands as a symbol for anyone who has ever fought for their culture, their identity, or their right to exist. He shows that a man can be humble and strong, peaceful and powerful, that real bravery is not found in destruction, but in standing for truth. His grave, wherever it truly lies, has become a place of pilgrimage. Visitors leave feathers, stones, and tobacco, small gifts for a great spirit. They come not to mourn him, but to draw strength from him. For though more than a century has passed, the lessons of Sitting Bull remain alive, that the earth belongs to no one, that all people are connected, that dignity is worth more than wealth. He once said, "Behold, my friends, the spring is come. The earth has gladly received the embraces of the sun, and we shall soon see the results of their love." Those words remind us that life renews itself, that even after death the spirit continues, and so, when the sun sets over the wide plains and the wind hums through the tall grass, the Lakota still believe they hear his voice, deep, calm, and unbroken. The voice of a man who never gave up, a man who defied an empire yet carried peace in his heart. Sitting Bull, the warrior, the prophet, the eternal spirit of the plains. More than a century has passed since the day Sitting Bull fell beneath the winter sky, yet his spirit still rides the wind. The world around him has changed. Nations have risen and fallen, borders have shifted, and the plains he once roamed have become towns and farmlands. But the power of his name, the story of his courage, has never faded. Sitting Bull's life was more than the story of one man. It was the story of an entire people, their pride, their suffering, and their unbreakable will to endure. He was born when the buffalo were plenty and the land was free, and he died when both were taken away. But through it all, he stood firm like a mountain against the wind. He never led his people with greed or fear. He led them with faith, faith in the Great Spirit, faith in the power of unity, and faith in the belief that truth would outlive violence. He understood something most men never do, that you cannot own the earth. You can only belong to it. Even those who once called him an enemy eventually came to respect him. Generals who fought against him admitted his bravery. Writers who once condemned him later called him a hero. And historians today describe him as one of the most powerful voices for freedom ever to walk the American continent. Sitting Bull's story reaches far beyond the Lakota Nation. It belongs to everyone who has ever stood against injustice, who has refused to surrender their dignity, who has chosen principle over fear. He reminds the world that true strength does not come from guns or armies. It comes from conviction. To the Lakota, he remains more than a memory. He is an ancestor, a guide, and a symbol of hope. Every year, when the people gather on the prairies to honor him, they speak his name with pride. They dance, they sing, and they tell their children, "This is who we come from." For them, remembering is not an act of sorrow, it is an act of survival. Through his descendants and his tribe, Sitting Bull still walks among his people. In their prayers his voice is still heard. In their hearts his courage still burns. His words echo through time. The white man knows how to make everything, but he does not know how to share. Let us put our minds together and see what kind of life we can make for our children. Simple words, yet they hold the wisdom of generations. He taught that peace cannot exist without respect, and that progress means nothing if it destroys what gives life meaning. Even now, those lessons speak louder than ever. Across the world, people still draw inspiration from him. Activists, teachers, leaders, and dreamers who see in his story a reflection of their own struggles. His life has become a mirror for all who believe in justice and harmony between man and nature. At Standing Rock, where the Missouri River bends through the plains, his people continue to protect the land and water. When they stand before bulldozers and pipelines, they do not do it with hate. They do it with the same quiet strength Sitting Bull once carried. They do it because they remember, and somewhere in the rustling grass and whispering wind, his presence is there, unseen but deeply felt. A reminder that courage never dies. Sitting Bull's legacy is not carved in stone or written in history books. It lives in every person who dares to speak the truth, even when the world is silent. It lives in every act of kindness, every choice to defend what is right, every voice that refuses to be silenced. He was more than a warrior. He was a bridge between the old world and the new, between what was and what could still be. Through him, we are reminded that humanity's greatest battles are not fought on battlefields, but within hearts. Even now, his story teaches us that peace requires strength, that freedom demands sacrifice, and that the greatest leaders are those who serve with love. And perhaps, if one listens closely enough to the wind that crosses the Dakota plains, you can still hear his spirit, steady and calm, whispering across the ages, "I have done my duty. The rest belongs to the Great Spirit." The sun sets beyond the horizon, painting the land gold and red, the same colors that once marked the Lakota war paint, the same colors of earth and blood. The plains grow quiet but not empty, for this land, this sky, and this story still belong to him. Sitting Bull, the holy man, the warrior, the prophet, the one who stood when others bowed, the one who dreamed when others despaired, the one who defied an empire and became eternal. And as long as there are people who believe in truth, honor, and freedom, as long as the wind still sings across the plains, Sitting Bull will never die.